Hi there, this is Dr. Ramey, and I'm going to talk about photosynthesis. Here's the general equation for photosynthesis. It should look familiar because in many respects it's the opposite of the general equation for aerobic cellular respiration. We have 6 carbon dioxides are consumed. Of course, we're talking about per molecule of glucose. So 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules. Energy from sunlight are used to produce sugar. So in this case, glucose, which has a chemical equation of C6H12O6, and 6 oxygens. So this chemical energy that's produced by photosynthesis is stored in these covalent bonds here of glucose. You can see there's a lot of covalent bonds. Glucose is an organic molecule. Organic molecules are pretty easy to spot as long as you know that organic molecules contain both carbons and hydrogens. So water, hydrogens but no carbons, so not an organic molecule. CO2, carbons but no hydrogens, not an organic molecule. And water, I already said water. Oxygen, not organic, oxygens but no carbons or hydrogens, right? So you see that glucose has both carbons, hydrogens. It's an organic molecule. The covalent bonds of glucose contain high energy electrons, right? So they're excited high energy electrons in here. And the energy that went into exciting those electrons, can you guess where that energy came from? It came from the sun, right? It came from the sun. So the source of the carbons here that are used to make glucose and the other organic molecules that are produced by photosynthesizers like these trees here, that source of carbons is carbon dioxide. So when we say that CO2 is fixed, so carbon fixation, that's where carbons are stripped from CO2, which is an inorganic molecule, and used to produce organic molecules like glucose, right? So that's where the carbons come from, right here. The electrons, those high energy electrons that I referred to that go into a glucose molecule come from water, right? So those electrons get excited by sunlight and then get incorporated into the covalent bonds of glucose, those sugars. And the oxygens are a result of water being split. So to strip these electrons away from water, the water is split, so these electrons are stripped from water. When that occurs, oxygen is produced as a result. So that's where the oxygens come from. So if you look at this picture over here, the water, if we talk about, focus on plants, of course there are other photosynthesizers, lots of other photosynthesizers other than plants, like cyanobacteria and algae, which are photosynthetic protists. So the water in this case is going to typically be absorbed from the roots and be distributed throughout the plant. The CO2 is going to come from the air, the atmosphere. Oxygen is going to be released back into the atmosphere as a result of photosynthesis. The energy for all of this is coming from the sun, and then ultimately sugars like glucose and other organic molecules are going to be produced as a result. So if I, let me just draw a big rectangle here to represent a plant cell. Okay. And not all, but some plant cells contain chloroplasts. So I'm going to make a big oval to represent chloroplasts. Of course, chloroplasts are, relative to the size of the cell, are much smaller than that. Chloroplasts have a double membrane, and that is a result of the endosymbiotic theory explains the origin of chloroplasts, which of course were some kind of cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic bacteria that were engulfed during the evolution of some eukaryotic cells like plant cells. That resulted in a double membrane, and inside here, the inside portion of the chloroplast called the stroma, there are these stacks of what look like green pancakes. So one green pancake is a thylakoid, and then a whole stack is a granum. And that is where half of photosynthesis takes place, is in the thylakoids, right? So photosynthesis is broken into two parts: the light reactions, or the light dependent reactions, and the light independent reactions. And the light independent reactions are often referred to as the Calvin cycle, right? So here's the Calvin cycle, aka the light independent reactions, or sometimes referred to as the dark reactions. So those are the two parts of photosynthesis. One, the light reactions that take place in the thylakoids, and the light independent reactions, aka the Calvin cycle, that takes place in the stroma, inside the chloroplast, but not in the thylakoids. So that gives us a general kind of idea of where all this stuff is taking place, right? And remember, of course, for photosynthesis to occur, it needs energy from light, it needs CO2, and it needs water, right? And so these are the sometimes referred to as the reactants, although it's kind of awkward to call light a reactant, but I guess in this case it works, right? So those are kind of the reactants of photosynthesis. And then we get the products of photosynthesis. Of course, the main product is glucose. Now, sometimes you'll see this labeled as G3P, and that's a 3-carbon sugar that is used ultimately to make glucose and other organic molecules. So, you know, the immediate main product of photosynthesis is G3P, and then that is in turn used to make lots of glucose. So we'll say that the main product of photosynthesis is glucose, and then of course we get oxygen as a product of photosynthesis as well. So if we focus on plants as our model photosynthesizer, then not all plant cells are capable of photosynthesis. The main part of the plant where photosynthesis has taken place is in the leaves. You can think of any part of the plant that's green contains cells that can photosynthesize. The green color comes from the main pigments that are in chloroplasts, which have a green color, right? So the main pigments are green, and any cell that is capable of photosynthesis has hundreds, maybe thousands of chloroplasts, and so those cells just look green. And so parts of a plant that have lots of these photosynthetic cells are going to look green, right? Like a leaf. And inside the chloroplast, as we kind of looked at in the last slide, you've got these stacks of thylakoid pancakes where half of photosynthesis takes place, the light reactions, and then outside of the thylakoids, but still in the chloroplast, is where the Calvin cycle takes place, aka the dark reactions or the light independent reactions. So the light reactions, right, we need the energy is coming from photons, which are in sunlight, so that we need sunlight. The electrons are coming from water, and when water is oxidized, right, to extract those electrons, then that results in the production of O2, right, atmospheric oxygen. And then the CO2 is required in the Calvin cycle, and that's where, of course, you can see G3P here. That is ultimately going to be used to make sugar. So here we have the main product of photosynthesis here, sugar, and then of course that's where the oxygen is produced there. So the oxygen is produced during the light reactions, and the sugars produced during the Calvin cycle, or as a result of the light independent reactions. So as I mentioned, photosynthesis really is a two-step process, where we've got the step one is the light reactions, and then step two is the Calvin cycle, aka the light independent reactions of the Calvin cycle. So, when we talk about the reactions of photosynthesis or just photosynthesis, really we're talking about both of those light dependent and light independent reactions together, because they have to function together simultaneously to produce the sugars and the oxygen during photosynthesis. So if we focus on the light dependent reactions first, those reactions are taking place in the thylakoid membranes, right? So remember, the thylakoids are these, let me go back one, are these green stacks of pancakes here, right? And so these thylakoids membranes, these are phospholipid bilayers, right? These phospholipid bilayers. So embedded in these phospholipid bilayers are these photosystems. So photosystems are these kind of special proteins that also contain special pigments that harvest the energy from light, right? So these pigments, which are part of these photosystems, and of course, you may have heard of chlorophyll, right? So chlorophyll A is one of the main pigments that we find in the photosystems, but not the only one. There are other pigments as well, and those pigments harvest this energy, and they transfer this energy really into an electron that becomes excited. So you have this energy ultimately is focused on an electron that has low energy. Where did that electron come from? It came from water. So these electrons that are stripped from water are these low energy electrons, and then those electrons are boosted up to a high energy or excited state, and the energy to do that comes from the light, right? So now we have these high energy electrons as a result of the light dependent reactions, and then those high energy electrons are either going to be used to make ATP at that point, or are going to be used to reduce NADP plus to NADPH. And of course, NADPH is very similar to the NADH that you were introduced to in aerobic cellular respiration. So it's a high energy electron carrier. And it's going to carry those high energy electrons to the Calvin cycle. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Just at this point, understand that these light dependent reactions are taking place in these photosystems. You've got these these pigments, chlorophyll and other pigments, that are focusing that light energy onto these electrons. The electrons come from water, right? And when water is oxidized, when those electrons are stripped away from water, that's where that oxygen comes from, and then we get these high energy electrons as a result. And those high energy electrons are going to go and be used again either to make ATP, or are going to be shuttled into the Calvin cycle, and ultimately those high energy electrons are going to be incorporated into the covalent bonds of glucose. So so sunlight is composed of photons. Photons contain energy, and in the visible spectrum, if we kind of blow up the visible spectrum here, got on one side kind of got the blues and the violets. On the other side, we've kind of got the oranges and the reds, with the greens in the middle, right? And so the most of the energy that is captured in the processes of photosynthesis come from both of these sides, and the green energy in these green wavelengths are, for the most part, ignored. They're not absorbed, and that's so they're reflected in a sense, and that explains why leaves have a green color, because that light is not used in photosynthesis, so it's just kind of reflected back, and as a consequence we see that green color. So in the photosystems, they have a variety of chloroplast pigments, right, in the photosystems. The most abundant and most important is chlorophyll A. It's a green color, right, which also explains why cells that contain chloroplasts are green, right, because most of the pigment in there is chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll B is also green. Then you got these carotenes and xanthophylls, and think about what the leaves of a tree look like when they get fall colors. When the chlorophyll A and B kind of disappear for a time, what's left are the carotenes and xanthophylls, and they have kind of a yellowish and orangish color. Think carrot, right? Think of the color of a carrot, and that's the color of those carotene pigments. And so these pigments are absorbing. You can see they're absorbing in these kind of blue and violet spectrum here, and then to some extent in the kind of the orange and the red wavelengths over here, but not really here where we get kind of the greens and some yellows, right? So most of the energy that's being used are in these wavelengths here and here, so the blues and the reds, and that energy is focused on these low energy electrons that come from water to boost these electrons up to a high energy state in the photosystems, right? So if we look at this light dependent reactions, remember they are located in the thylakoid membranes, and you've got multiple photosystems. So you can see this PS2 and PS1. That means photosystem 1 stands for photosystem 2. You can see that the electrons are coming from water, and they are being boosted up to a higher energy state using energy from the light in the photosystems, and some of those electrons are being shuttled through an electron transport chain. And in the processes of the electron transport chain, that energy from these high energy electrons are being used to pump protons across the thylakoid membrane. So this is almost exactly what's happening in cellular respiration, except the source of the electrons is different, right? The source of the electrons in cellular respiration is glucose, and here the source of the electrons is water, but those electrons from water still have to be energized before they can be used in the electron transport chain, and the energy to energize those electrons comes from light. And so these electrons, as they move through the electron transport chain here, fall back down to a low energy state, because that energy is used to pump, right, to pump these protons, and that produces energy in the form of a proton, a high proton gradient on one side of the thylakoid membrane. So that potential energy is then converted to kinetic energy and used to make ATP as the protons fall down the concentration gradient through ATP synthase, producing ATP. So this is referred to as photophosphorylation. phosphorylation, because it uses ultimately the energy that's used here or captured here to make the ATP came from, think photo, right? Came from light, came from there, right? So the energy here comes from light. And you're thinking, well, great, ATP. Why does a cell need glucose? Well, this ATP is actually consumed during photosynthesis. So I'll get to that in a minute. So glucose ultimately is, or the energy is ultimately used to make glucose. So ATP in photosynthesis is kind of an intermediate product, if you will. So there's where the ATP is made, and we'll talk about where it's needed in a minute. And then the electrons, here they're back in a low energy state. They're boosted up again to a high energy state in this photosystem, again using more light energy. And this time the high energy electrons are used to reduce NADP plus to NADPH, right? So I should have showed you this one a moment ago, but this is what's happening. So here on the left, sometimes this is referred to as the Z scheme or the Z diagram. I can't even spell scheme or diagram apparently. And this kind of maybe more simply explains what, or illustrates what I just explained, where you have these two photosystems here and here, and light energy is used to boost up the low energy electrons, and then those low energy electrons are used up in the electron transport, or the energy from those high energy electrons, are used by the electron transport chain to pump hydrogen ions, and then with the actions of ATP synthase and photophosphorylation are used to make ATP. And then those low energy electrons are then boosted up a second time, more light's needed for that, and then these high energy electrons are used to reduce NADP plus to NADPH. So where is the ATP and NADPH going, right? And if you guessed the Calvin cycle, you guessed correctly, right? So the Calvin cycle needs ATP, it needs NADPH, and it needs CO2, right? Well, the CO2 is easy. It comes from the air, right? And then the NADPH and ATP are produced in the light reactions of photosynthesis, those light reactions. So here we're only halfway done with photosynthesis, right? And we've produced some ATP, we've produced some NADPH, but we haven't produced any glucose. No glucose. We've also produced some oxygen. Of course, that oxygen is either going to be used by the plant for aerobic cellular respiration, which, of course, plant cells have mitochondria. They're making glucose for a reason, and they're going to ultimately use that glucose to make ATP, and the processes of converting glucose, the energy in glucose, to ATP, energy in ATP, happens by processes of aerobic cellular respiration. And that takes place inside, of course, the mitochondria, and needs oxygen, right? So I'll put plus O2. So some of the oxygen that is produced right here is actually going to be used by the plant for aerobic cellular respiration. The rest of it's going to be just excreted back into the atmosphere, of course, so there's a net production of oxygen here. So if you kind of compare the electron transport chain in photosynthesis kind of side by side with the electron transport chain in cellular respiration. So this is photosynthesis here, this is cellular respiration over here. They look very, very similar, and they're really doing the same things. They're using high energy electrons to pump hydrogen ions, aka protons, which are then used when they fall down through ATP synthase to make ATP. You can see all these components over on the left here in the thylakoid membrane as well. Of course, this on the right, this is the mitochondria. So this is the mighty mitochondria, and this is the thylakoid membrane in the chloroplast, right? Chloroplast, but very, very similar processes. But in the case of photosynthesis, we're only halfway done, right? So we now have, the ATP and NADPH. These right here, ATP and NADPH, are needed over in the Calvin cycle, the light independent reactions of the Calvin cycle. And the reason they're called light independent reactions is because, well, all the light in photosynthesis is used here in the reactions that take place in the thylakoids. So that's why those are called the light dependent reactions. And the Calvin cycle is sometimes referred to as the dark reactions or the light independent reactions, because light is not directly needed in the Calvin cycle. However, the Calvin cycle cannot take place in the dark. So I guess calling it the dark reactions is not as accurate as calling it the light independent reaction, because if the lights go out, then Calvin cycle stops. So they're not truly independent. The reactions of the Calvin cycle are not truly independent of light, right? Okay, so we've got an input of ATP and NADPH. Well, we know where those come from. Those come from the light-dependent reactions, right? And then CO2, well, we know CO2 just comes from the air. And those three reactants are consumed in the reactions of the Calvin cycle. The ATP is consumed, so we get ADP as a result, which is just going to be shuttled back into the light reactions. NADPH is oxidized to produce NADP plus, which is going to go back into the light reactions. And the energy and the energy from ATP and the high energy electrons from NADPH are going to ultimately be used to make glucose, right? Glucose. So that's where the glucose comes from. This is where the oxygen comes from over here. Okay, so the Calvin cycle kind of functions like a sugar factory. Right now, here it says this 3-carbon sugar, right? This G3P, but remember that G3P is then going to be used to make a variety of organic molecules, but we're going to say the main product here is glucose. And then what's that glucose going to be used for? Well, that glucose is going to be used in aerobic cellular respiration to make ATP. So glucose, and plants do that the same way that animal cells do, basically, where they use the mitochondria in the cells and the processes of aerobic cellular respiration, cellular respiration. Can you tell that I'm a great speller? Okay. So to make ATP, right? So that's why some of the oxygen that the plants are making are needed to convert energy and glucose into energy and ATP. Okay. So to summarize, we've got the light reactions that take place in the thylakoids, and those light reactions produce ATP and NADPH. You can see that here and here. And that's also where the oxygen comes from, right? We'll also say O2. But these two guys right here, ATP and NADPH, are going to be used in the light independent reactions of the Calvin cycle. So here you have the ATP and the NADPH, and the CO2 is fixated by an enzyme called rubisco. It's a very common molecule, and it is used, plants use it in carbon fixation to strip away the carbons from CO2, ultimately using those carbons to make sugar, right? So we get a lot of sugar that is produced as a result of the light independent reactions. But remember, the light independent reactions cannot happen in the dark. Why? Because in the dark, these things stop being produced, ATP and NADPH, right? Because they're produced in the light dependent reactions over here. So in that sense, the light independent reactions really are still tied to the sunlight. I hope that this was a helpful summary of photosynthesis. I'll see you all in class.